Would you ask Ms Hammond to come back in, please? All right, Ms Hammond, ready to carry on, I hope?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr Millett?
Yes, thank you, Mr Chairman. Ms Hammond, I just want to explore one or two further aspects of the NRA process, which we looked at before the break. And I think I asked you about whether anybody ever performed a comparison of the differences in the types of community displaced by different incidents. You said you thought it was unlikely at a national level, but the sort of consideration that you would expect to happen in relation to a local risk assessment. You'll recall that evidence. Two questions flow from that. The first is, would the CCS recognise that the impact of emergencies, and in this case displacement, mass displacement of residents from their homes, could affect different social and economic groups and localities in different ways?
Yes.
It would it? What was the mechanism for recognising that?
Well, in a way, it is the basis for the principle of subsidiarity on which the system is based, which recognises that local knowledge is often crucial in a response. So, in the example you've given, local understanding of the impact of a particular event on a community has been shown pretty regularly to be really important in delivering the right kind of response.
Did the NRA, given that it was leading nationally on risk assessment, recognise these differing socio-economic factors and consequently include consideration of those potentially differing outcomes within it?
I think in the NRA, risks are set out as single scenarios intended to be usable everywhere in the country. The guidance which accompanies it for use by local planners, I think, does draw out the need to bring in those local factors, but they are not drawn out for every community in the UK, understandably, in the national document.
Was there any direction or instructional guidance given to local planners to consider these different socio-economic factors which might affect different groups in different ways when it came to outcomes?
I would have to refresh my memory of exactly what the local guidance says, I'm afraid, but I'm very happy to do that. They would, of course, be subject to the public sector equality duty in the same way as anyone in the public sector is, so they would have had that in their minds.
I follow. So just to be clear about that, is your evidence that when the local planners, the LRFs, created their own risk registers, in providing for their planning assumptions and capabilities, they would be required in law, is this right, to take account of the various different protected characteristics under the Equality Act?
That's my understanding, yes.
Right. Now then, let's turn to the National Risk Register. Is it right that the NRA forms the basis for the National Risk Register?
Correct.
And that was a public document at the time, yes?
Correct.
And the most recent NRR, to use the acronym, before the Grenfell Tower fire, was, I think, published in March 2015, was it?
I think that's correct, yes.
We can go, I think, to that document. It's CAB 407009. And we can see under chapter, that's the 2015 edition. We can see, if we go to page 4, we can see the contents page, or part of it. We seem to be stuck. I'd like CAB 407009. You can see there's a different. Well, let me take it more quickly, because there may be a snag with the numbering. But do you recall that there was no mention in this document of an urban or tower block fire?
I think that would be correct, as it wasn't a scenario identified in the NRA.
Right. But there was wildfire set out, pages 27 and 28. Perhaps we could have pages 27 and 28 there, which is. No, there you see it, there you don't. There, if you go to page 27, you can see severe wildfires risk outline. And if you turn to page 28, you can see under 2.63, casualties from wildfires tend to be low. But there could be significant distress and health consequences, such as an increase in respiratory ailments due to smoke or fumes. Now, was any work ever done to establish whether a casualty bureau had ever been established as a result of a wildfire, or a friends and relatives reception centre, or a rest centre, or any other of the kinds of centre contemplated certainly by the London resilience frameworks?
I'm afraid I can't recall at this distance, but very happy to go away and look for the answer to that question.
Right. Right. Now, following the fire, the Grenfell Tower fire, I think it was right that the NRA, the National Risk Register, had been updated, the NRR, and right that the 2019 version of the assessment is now called the National Security Risk Assessment?
Correct.
And that, I think, does include an example, by way of a risk, of a fire in a high-rise residential building as a reasonable worst-case
Yes, it does.
risk. Yes. Now, let's go to your second statement at page 20, where you cover this. That's CAB 30144799, page 20, at paragraph 67. You say, I personally recall being involved in discussions about the inclusion of this risk in the 2019 NSRA. Although we continued to be of the view that the outcomes of this risk were already covered by the existing NRPAs, we nevertheless took the view that the prominence of the Grenfell Tower fire in the national consciousness meant that it could not be omitted. This was also underpinned by the knowledge that local resilience forums would be looking at their own plans for tower block fires in response to the events at Grenfell, and we wanted to ensure such plans had a helpful and consistent basis for doing so. Just looking at that, in a nutshell, was it the case that you included Grenfell Tower fire, not because it wasn't adequately catered for in the 2016 version of the NRA, but for political reasons?
No, not for political reasons, but because we knew from contact between my colleagues and LRFs that they would be thinking specifically about this type of risk, and as it says in the statement, because we wanted to be helpful to them in doing so.
But the risk profile hadn't changed, had it, between the 2016 version and the 2019 version?
I think if in a couple of paragraphs above the one you're referring to, it does set out some of the differences in our understanding of the risk that were drawn as lessons from the Grenfell Tower fire. Those differences in understanding still meant, however, that the risk was covered by the planning assumptions as set out in paragraph 67. So it was an enhanced understanding. The primary reason for including it was to be of assistance to local planners.
Right, so let's pick that up then. Paragraph 65, higher up, page 20. You say, our enhanced understanding, bolstered by updated Home Office modelling of fire risk following the Grenfell Tower fire, meant that the consequences of a tower block fire were more significant than previously assessed. Now, was there a reason why that risk had not been assessed for the specific purpose of the NRA until after the fire?
I think, Mr. Bennett, this goes to a question you asked me before about previous consideration of similar fires where we have an absence of evidence. But following the Grenfell Tower fire, we, of course, used the knowledge gained there to look again at this kind of scenario and make sure we understood its impacts fully. Right.
Well, let me be more focused then. What was it that enhanced your understanding?
So I think that's quite a specialised question that I would defer to my more expert colleagues on. But the use of the cladding in particular is drawn out in the statement as an element which suggested more serious consequences than I think had previously been understood.
What was the updated Home Office modelling about, in general terms?
Modelling of the impact of a fire of that kind.
Of what kind?
A tower block fire.
Right, but I mean, was it a cladding fire on a high-rise, or was it any kind of fire within a high-rise that enhanced your understanding, leading to the inclusion of this risk in the 2019 NSRA?
My recollection is it was the modelling of a tower block fire, including cladding, but I would have to verify that with my Home Office colleagues.
So, was it included because of the national consciousness, or now being directed to towers like Grenfell, or was it because an urban fire or tower block fire should have been in the NRA before 2019, but was a historical omission?
So, as I said before, even with the addition of this new scenario, it did not move the planning assumptions for local responders to use. So on that basis, we wouldn't describe it as a historical omission, but clearly the terrible events at Grenfell were very much in the minds of planners, and we wanted to assist them in reviewing their own plans for this type of scenario. So that was the primary driver for its inclusion. But of course that drew on the knowledge gained in this event.
So does it come to this, that it was included not because the risk profile was any different from how it had been in 2016, but really for the look of the thing, because a national risk register without a Grenfell in it would look lopsided or incomplete?
No, not for the look of the thing, but to be of assistance to planners focusing on that type of fire.
Then I think it's right, isn't it, that the National Risk Register of September 2017, which was after the fire, but only just, was updated to include the risk of fire in a residential building. Do you remember that?
Correct.
And that made specific reference to the Grenfell Tower fire within it, yes?
Yes,
Yes.
for the same reason.
Yes, I mean, for reference purposes, we can see that at CAB 6069. I don't think there's a need to go to that. But let's go to the 2020 edition of the National Risk Register at INQ 30 is 15149. And if we go, please, to Chapter 4, which we're going to find on page 83, under the heading Major Fires, within the section Major Incidents. You can see there's a great deal there, which is set out, and one of the questions is, have such events happened before? You can see that. And to the left of that, you see two chunks of text. Major fires can start for many reasons, including, and then consequences of major fires may include potential fatalities, physical and or psychological casualties, potential evacuation and shelter of affected people, damage to property and infrastructure, disruption to essential services, particularly the availability of fire and rescue services, economic costs, environmental damage, air pollution, and potential water contamination. And then under have such events happened before, as I showed you, there's a reference to the Grenfell Tower fire itself. Now, under capability, if you go to the right-hand side of the page, you can see there's a reference to fire and rescue services having the capability to fight high-rise fires, yes?
Yes.
And if you turn to page 84, you can see a reference to other areas, including wellbeing support under government action. You see that?
Yes.
And then if you go to page 85, you can see a reference to independent inspection regimes for fire and rescue services as part of the independent inspections. The question is, looking at all of those things, why did the CCS not consider those issues for the purposes of the NRR before the Grenfell Tower fire?
I think because this document is drawing on the much greater understanding of a fire of this type, drawn from the Grenfell Tower experience, in the way you would expect, I think, us to learn those lessons and draw them into future processes.
Yes, and that prompts a question I asked you before. What was it about the Grenfell Tower fire that prompted lessons to be learnt such that they were embedded in this document, which had not been learnt from fires at Lacknell House, Shirley Towers, and at the Adair Tower fire, and other high-rise fires before 2017?
And it's difficult for me to answer your question, Mr. Millett, because that is before my time in CCS, and we have not found evidence of consideration of those specific risks.
Do you accept looking back on it, that if an urban or tower block fire had been included in the 2016 National Risk Register as a result of the National Risk Assessment, it would have provided a specific focus for local planners to be able to assess and plan for.
Yes, I think they would have used it in that way.
Let's then turn to a different topic, which is preparation and planning. Now, I think you accepted earlier, as is obvious, that the emergency preparedness documents is the statutory guidance which accompanies the 2004 Act. And additionally, there's the emergency response and recovery non-statutory guidance from October 2013. On that, is it right that required humanitarian assistance to be provided in the event of an emergency?
Yes, that's one element of the response, and there's specific guidance on human aspects of a response also.
Are you able to assist with why emergency preparedness, that's the title of the document, is statutory guidance, but ERR, emergency response and recovery, is not? It's only non-statutory.
I'm afraid I can't recall that, but very happy to go away and ask the question.
Right. And now turning to the second of those then, the non-statutory response, let's look at that. It's at CAB 404624. Now that's the first page of it, and you can see at the bottom of the page, it's dated October 2013.
Correct.
And its full title is Emergency Response and Recovery, Non-Statutory Guidance Accompanying the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. And if we go, please, in that to page 116, can I just ask you before we do, were you reasonably familiar with this document at the time of the fire?
Yes, at the time of the fire. I haven't studied it in any detail for the past 2 years, however.
No, I understand. But at the time of the fire, this is something that you would have been reasonably familiar with. Can we proceed on that basis?
It would have been used by the CCS team and by local responders, who are the primary intended audience for this.
Then let's go to page 116, paragraph 7.1.1. What is humanitarian assistance? And it explains what it is, with a number of bullet points underneath that. If you just look at those. Were you familiar with that provision, or at least the gist of it at the time?
Yes, those are consequences that are often a consideration following a crisis event.
Right. Yes, I don't want to read them all out, but you can see the basic shelter, information about what has happened, medical assistance, financial and legal support, psychosocial support, etc. And also, at the bottom, providing a point of contact for longer-term support and advice. If we go to page 129, a little bit further on in the document, we see 7.7.1, meeting the needs of specific groups as the title, and 7.7.1 says, the care and support needs of a range of groups require special consideration. This section focuses on 4 groups, which can make challenging demands on responding agencies. These are children and young people, faith, religious or cultural groups, elderly people, and people with disabilities. For more information on identifying vulnerable groups, see, and there's a link, identifying people who are vulnerable in a crisis. Were you familiar with that principle or set of principles?
With set out in 7.7.1?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we then go to just pick up the point you referred to earlier about the equality legislation, Robert Macfarlane's third statement, we find that at CAB 30014862. Please, page 6. That's CAB 30014862. Right, I don't know why that's taking some time to come up, but let me take it more shortly. Was it your understanding, as it was his, that the Equality Act 2010 required local authorities to have due regard to the needs of people with relevant protected characteristics.
Yes.
Yes, and that would that may include specific groups when they carry out emergency planning and emergency responses.
Yes.
Yes. And do you share his view, and I'll just give the reference, paragraph 17, we don't perhaps now need to go to it, that failure to comply with the public sector equality duty could lead to discrimination in the delivery of emergency responses, such that certain groups could receive a less effect from the local authority and thus experience a greater degree of trauma?
Yes, I think that is completely logical.
And a greater degree of distress and inconvenience
Yes.
when compared with other groups. Yes, you do. Now, let's then go back to your first statement, please. CAB 30147764. Let's go to page 7, paragraph 26. And you say there, CCS also leads on the following capability work streams, and that includes A, evacuation and shelter with the DCLG and devolved administrations as key delivery partners. And you say that the CCS published the non-statutory evacuation and shelter guidance in 2014, and that, we can look at that, is at CAB 404627. We just look at that. There it is. And if we turn on to page 2, and then page 4, you can see the contents on page 4. And it has, at Annex A, page 57, scales of evacuation. My question was that document designed to help local planners write their local evacuation and shelter plans?
Yes, that it is intended for a local audience.
Right. And I think there's a further document, CAB 6036. This is called the Human Aspects in Emergency Management, Guidance on Supporting Individuals Affected by Emergencies, and that's October 2016. Was that designed to support local responders' planning and coordination of human aspects activities, if I can put them that way, in the response and recovery phases of an emergency?
Yes, that's correct.
And would it be fair to say, looking at those two documents, that the humanitarian needs of individuals in the context of emergency is firmly embedded in the policy framework as something which must be catered for in an emergency response?
I would say so, yes.
Yes, and always subject to the public sector equality duty.
Of course.
That you've accepted. And a third document is what I think I can call CONOPS. And you've heard of CONOPS.
I have.
And is its full title The Central Government Arrangements for Responding to an Emergency, Concept of Operation? Yes?
Correct.
And that is, let's just have it up, at CAB 6026. There it is. This one is the one that was updated in April 2013, as you can see from the bottom of the screen. Am I right in thinking that that describes how the UK central government response will be organised and the relationship between central, regional and local tiers in England?
Yes, that's right.
Right. Now, I've shown you a swathe of documents and asked you about them. We'll come back to CONOPS later. But my question for present purposes is this. How are these guidance documents and policy documents, such as the one we've looked at, disseminated to local responders to make sure that they are properly taken into account locally for local emergency planning and response?
So they are made available through an online platform which local responders can access. Many of them will also have hard copies of these documents, and of course anybody struggling to find one could come to CCS and ask for it to be sent to them.
Right. And would you centrally expect those locally in the position of responsibility for planning and making assumptions about capabilities be familiar with these documents?
Yes, I would hope so. The purpose of them is to assist in that responsibility.
And I now want to turn to, well, let me just ask you this. Before the fire, before the Grenfell Tower fire, had concerns been raised by respondents about the complexity or quantity of guidance and policy documents out there?
I can't recollect a specific concern being raised with me. There's certainly a lot of documentation, but I can't remember a complaint being made. No.
Right. Do you recall any occasion on which you received the complaint or criticism, or heard others doing so, that the civil contingencies framework was an architectural edifice which was of Byzantine complexity, which defeated local or central planners?
I can't recall anybody putting that point to me, no.
In that way or in any other?
Not in my recollection.
Right. Let's turn to resilience then. Now, Robert McFarlane is someone I've tried to show you his evidence for before. He was the Deputy Director for UK Resilience Training in the CCS, wasn't he?
Training Doctrine and Standards, I think, was his full title.
Right. Now then, let's see if we can get back to his statement, please. CAB 30149794. CAB 30149794. This is his first statement. And if we go to page 3, paragraph 11, he says here, the training aspect of my responsibilities can be divided into two main areas. One, the direction, support and assurance of the Emergency Planning College, the EPC, in its UK and international operations. And two, the development and provision of crisis management training to central government. We turn the page, please. Central government. Quantitatively, oversight of the EPC makes up the majority of this work. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I'm sure Rob is correct.
Right, and if we go to paragraph 14 on page 4, he says there, Serco is responsible for the day-to-day operation of the EPC, but it is operated for and on behalf of the Cabinet Office. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And it's right to think also, and tell me if this isn't right, that the EPC provides training, exercising and advisory services to a wide range of different bodies, including government departments, but also public authorities and the private sector.
That's right, yes.
And that includes, I think, but isn't limited to Category 1 and Category 2 responders, yes?
Absolutely not limited to, but it does include them, certainly.
It does include them. And is it right, the EPC courses are not mandatory for government departments or indeed Category 1 or 2 responders?
That's correct. They could choose to use a different provider.
Then let's move to page 6 of this statement, please, paragraph 21 under the heading Central Government Training. He says this, civil servants from central government departments can and do attend training at the EPC. Most new starters in CCS will attend training at the EPC. This is not just so that they will learn about the framework of emergency planning and response arrangements in the UK and the allocation of duties under the 2004 Act. Participation in EPC training courses is also an opportunity for new CCS colleagues to learn alongside delegates from the emergency services with whom most civil servants would have had limited experience prior to joining CCS. I take it you agree with that?
Yes. The final statement, of course, people come to CCS from a whole range of backgrounds. So we do have people from emergency service backgrounds and those with more experience, but there's a wide range of prior experience, I would say.
And he goes on to say in paragraph 22, the EPC also conducts quite a significant amount of resilience training and exercise work for other government departments. It is open to departments to approach the EPC and request such training. The EPC will work together with the department to develop bespoke training and exercises to help the department improve its ability to respond to and recover from emergencies that might fall within their area of responsibility. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Now, against that background that I've shown you from his statement, can I show you his third exhibit, which is CAB 3014793. This is a spreadsheet. If we can go to the native, please. And what I'm showing you here is, I'll wait for it to pop up. And if we can go to the top of the document, please. Thank you. Yes, this is a spreadsheet which records central government attendees at EPC courses in the years 2014 to 2017. And you can see that in the right-hand foremost columns there. Now, if we go down together to line 119, row 119, scroll down further, we can see the entry for DCLG, right? And if you look across the columns E and E, F, G, and H, you can see that in those years, two staff members went in 2014, one in 2015, one in 2016, that's column G, and none in 2017, that's column H, to June. So only 4 delegates in total in those 4 years, or 3.5 years. And similarly, if we go to row 202, which is the Home Office, we can see that between 2014 and 2017, in total only 4 delegates attended training with the EPC from that government department, 2 in 2014 and 2 in 2016, none in 2015 or in 2017 to June. Now, was it normal for that number of delegates from those government departments or government departments of that kind to go to attend EPC training?
I'm not sure I quite understand your question. Normal in what sense?
Normal in the sense that were these numbers a handful? Was that a standard number? Was it common that so few would attend EPC courses?
I think to answer that question, I would have to look back at records of previous years, which I'm afraid I don't have to hand.
Well, let's compare it, perhaps, with your own department, which you might be able to help with. If we go to row 7, Cabinet Office, and there we see, in total, take it from me, 94 people from the Cabinet Office attending a training session, at least one, with EPC in those years. 18 in 2014, 26 in 2015, 36 in 2016, and 14 in 2017. Can you account for the difference, at least on paper, in the sheer numbers of attendees that your office sent for training at the EPC in those years and the numbers that the Home Office and the DCLG sent in those years?
I can certainly account for the Cabinet Office attendees. So Cabinet Office has a relatively high turnover of staff, so we would expect new starters every year. And as Rob said in his statement, the vast majority of them, unless they were in roles for which it was not relevant, would attend one or more of the EPC courses as a matter of routine. And because the EPC is operated from CCS, of course, that was the supplier we used. I think what I can't do, unfortunately, is describe the DCLG or Home Office practice, but I can certainly describe the Cabinet Office practice to you.
Well, at any given time, roughly how many staff members are there, or were there during your time at the Cabinet Office?
Around 100 in CCS.
Right. So, around 100. So, over the 4 years, I use an expression which is a description, but would you agree that a very significant number of personnel in the Cabinet Office attended EPC for training on a variety of topics?
Yes, although I think some of these are delegate numbers, so the same person may be represented multiple times, but I could certainly agree that quite a high number of courses were attended.
Yes. Were you aware that in other departments that the numbers that you were sending to EPC courses were not matched?
No, I wasn't monitoring those numbers.
Did you have as it were, I can use this expression here, 3-line whip within the CCS to send people on training courses at the EPC? Were there strong incentives for them to go?
It was a part of normal induction and learning processes on arrival.
Did you attend any of the training sessions yourself? If we scroll down, you can cast your eye down the course name. Were any of these those which you attended, do you think?
Do you know, it's very difficult to recall. I've certainly spent quite a lot of time at the EPC and dipped in and out of courses. I would have to go back and check if any of these represent me.
Right, but do you recall going to the EPC?
Yes.
You do. Let's go then to CAB 3014792. This is RHM2, exhibited by Mr. McFarlane. Different spreadsheet. Can we also have the native of this? That's CAB 3014792. What I'm showing you now is... We need to get rid of that one, I think. Yes, that's it. Now, there are two tabs. There's Category 1 responders and Category 2 responders, and what these are is spreadsheets held by the CCS recording Category 1 and Category 2 attendees at EPC training in the same years, 2014 and 2017. And if we go to the Category 1 responders tab, you can see it there. If we go, please, to row 74, we can see the GLA, and in the first 2 years of the date range, 10 go in 2014, 4 go in 2015, and none in 16 or 17. And at row 317, we can see RBKC. We go to row 317, we can see RBKC. And they send 2 in 2014, none in 2015, 1 in 2016, and none in 2017. And we can see the 3 courses that those 3 delegates attended. Perhaps they were the same person between years 14 and 16, we don't know. But there are the 3 topics. One is crowd modelling, one is working in safety advisory groups, and one is an evening lecture on event risk management. Compare that with row, with Westminster. If you don't scroll down, please, to row 328, you can see very different numbers. It's 47 in 2014, 38 in 2015, 2 in 2016, and 1 in 2017. You may not be able to help with the specifics, but are you able to help with why the numbers would have dropped off for a central urban LA, local authority, attending EPC for training on contingencies?
I'm afraid I can't without investigating further. I don't know the profile and existing qualifications of their staff or their turnover.
Right. Now, we've seen the figures for RBKC. Can I take it that you weren't yourself aware that RBKC had not undertaken any EPC civil protection training between 2014 and 2017?
No.
You weren't aware of that. Does it surprise you?
It's really, I'm sorry, this sounds unhelpful, and it's not meant to be, but it's very difficult to make an evaluation of the numbers without understanding the nature of the staff and their past experience in this snapshot of time. So it is obviously lower by comparison, but I don't have information on the reasons for that, I'm afraid.
Well, I understand that, but it's not lower numbers, it's nil, isn't it? Would you expect a central London authority, RBKC is the case in point, to have had no EPC training to any of its staff on contingency planning in the 4 years or 3.5 years before the Grenfell Tower fire?
I would expect them to have staff trained to an appropriate standard, but the EPC is not the only supplier. And as I say, I have no information on the existing qualifications of their staff, so I'm finding it difficult to draw an inference from it.
Now, that leads to another question, which is whether or not there was a system within the CCS for monitoring and supervising these outcomes. Was there a system whereby the CCS examined the figures and took the laggards and notified them that they were not keeping up with their EPC training and they should be doing more?
No, not to my knowledge.
Can we go back to Mr. McFarlane's statement, please? His first statement, CAB 3014794, paragraph 23, page 7. He says there, in addition, since 2007 and working with CCS colleagues, my team has provided introductory training for civil servants in central government whose roles are likely to require them to work within or work with COBRA. The course covers what COBRA is, what their place in it is, what is expected of their departments, and what is expected of them as an individual in their particular roles. It also addresses behaviour, how you conduct your role in COBRA to good effect under the considerable pressures of working in a crisis. The training is divided into 2 tiers. One tier is aimed at senior civil servants, i.e. departmental principals, and one is aimed at junior civil servants, i.e. those supporting the principals and decision makers. The programme is, with very few exceptions, internal to the central government departments and agencies. Is that training mandatory, do you recall?
I don't think it's mandatory, but it's very much expected for those who will be having a direct role in COBRA.
Did you yourself undertake it?
I think I did when I started in CCS.
When you started. And have you yourself undertaken any other training relating to resilience and emergency preparedness and response?
I would have to go and refer back to my diaries, I'm afraid.
Right. So you can't say you definitely didn't. You might have done, but you can't remember.
I'm afraid I had not refreshed my memory of that before today. Apologies.
Now let's turn then to the third aspect of CCS, its focus, which is response and recovery. You referred to the concept of subsidiarity earlier on this afternoon, I think. And is it right that the UK's emergency planning and response arrangements are based on that concept, subsidiarity?
Yes, it's one of the principles embedded.
And I think you describe it, let's look at your own words, page 3 of your first statement, paragraph 11. I think we've looked at this before, but you say there, in the second line, local responders are best placed to identify the risks in their areas and to put appropriate plans and capability in place to respond to these risks within the framework provided by the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. Does that tell us that the presumption during emergencies is that they will be handled at a local level?
So subsidiarity basically means that you take the decision at the lowest possible level and coordinate at the highest appropriate level. So it doesn't mean that you can only take decisions at a local level, but the default is that that is the starting position with escalation upwards as required.
Yes, I see. And if you go, please, to paragraph 10, just above that, you say, the work of CCS is underpinned by the concept of integrated emergency management. This recognises that many types of incident require broadly similar capabilities, irrespective of cause, and that the response to such incidents should normally be locally led and delivered in the main by locally owned and managed capabilities. They should be supported where necessary by specialist assets provided through mutual aid arrangements or by national support. What do you mean by national support there?
So often in a moment of emergency or crisis, local responders will ask for additional help. So a good example, for example, is asking for assistance from the military, for which there's a well-established process. So that would come through to a national level body like COBRA, who would authorise that request into the MOD. I
see. So national support, is this right, could only be secured by COBRA, or are there other central government bodies that could do that?
Not only by COBRA, sometimes by direct discussion, but often in a crisis, those discussions tend to be happening in the COBRA room or in the ministerial meeting room.
Now, you refer also there to specialist assets provided through mutual aid arrangements. What were those?
So a variety of different types of assets exist on a national basis, including, for example, capabilities to deal with large numbers of fatalities. That would be one instance. And there are a number of other types of assets which can be drawn on, but which exist once nationally rather than in every local area. Right.
Could you give me an example, please, of an asset which would be a capability to deal with large numbers of fatalities?
So there's a national mortuary capability intended to deal with large number of fatalities.
I see. Now, I want next to ask you about CONOPS. We looked at that before, and specifically look at Annex B, if we can. Can we go to that at CAB 6026? There's CONOPS. And if we go to page 68 within it, I want to show you Annex B. Are you familiar with this?
Yes.
Yes. Now, it's called Annex B, likely form of central government engagement based on the impact and geographic spread of an emergency in England. The diagram, I think, shows 5 different types of emergency with a corresponding colour. Is this right? Which indicates the form of central government involvement escalating in seriousness.
Yes, so the colour represents increasing severity across the matrix.
Yeah, yes. Now, looking at it, it's really just is this right? It's an indication. It's not a strict graph based on mathematical certainties, is it? Fixed points.
Correct. It's a guide to aid judgment in particular scenarios as to what type of response will be appropriate.
Right. And just to be clear, along the horizontal axis, you've got you start on the left with minimal parliamentary interest, significant parliamentary interest, dominating parliamentary party national debate, and then in the middle one, minimum LGD through RRT. Is that RQ or RO? What does that stand for?
Forgive me, are you on the second?
Second row of arrows in the horizontal section.
I think RRT is Rapid Response Team.
Yes. And then it goes on, it increases in severity. Crisis centre, collective response, central direction. So central direction would be in the most serious of cases, would it?
Yes.
And then in the bottom line, minimum LOD policy interest. And what's LOD? Is it LOD or else? It's difficult to see, I think, but even if we expand it, it doesn't much help.
It is not clear on my screen.
No, I'm sorry about that. Never mind. It increases in severity as well.
Yes.
And then on the vertical axis, you start with single scene, cross-force, regional coverage, cross-region, national coverage. And the various different colours go up from green to yellow to ochre to orange to red. So what would happen if you had a single scene but dominated national party or national debate and required central direction, and which was, you might call, overwhelming, at least locally? Where would that sit?
So there's, as you said before, there's no hard and fast boundaries in here, but clearly that would take you to the bottom right of the matrix, although the judgment is made specific to every event, so you'd want to take into account all of the specific circumstances in that moment.
Right. And now there are 2 references to a local response, the green and the yellow. Local response only in green and local response with GO providing two-way channel to central government stroke LGD in yellow. Now, LGD is Lead Government Department. What is GO?
I think that's referring to the Government Liaison Officer. There may be an L missing in the middle.
Oh, I see. Right. In addition to local response, I think we see 3 levels. Level 1 is significant LGD-led central response, COBRA not involved. Level 2, serious, coordinated central response led by LGD from COBRA. And then catastrophic, level 3, central direction from COBRA in red.
Correct.
Yes. Now, if we go back then to your first statement, please, at page 12, paragraph 37, you say there, the response to an emergency is usually carried out first and foremost by local organisations. In some instances, however, the scale or complexity of an emergency means that some degree of central government support or coordination is necessary. Where this is the case, a government department will be allocated as the lead for the overall management of the central government response. Where necessary, the central government crisis management machinery, also sometimes referred to as COBRA, will be activated to coordinate the cross-government response in the aftermath of a major emergency. Now, in that passage, are you referring there to the levels on the diagram that we've just been through?
Yes, I think though that diagram sets out in pictorial form the text which is in paragraph 37. It's the same concept.
I see. Now, you say that where necessary, the central government crisis management machinery, sometimes referred to as COBRA, will be activated in the aftermath of a major emergency. How is major emergency defined for the purposes of triggering COBRA responsibility?
So that there isn't a specific trigger point. In the event of an incident, there's always a conversation between CCS, the lead government department for that incident, and number 10 to make the judgment whether to activate the central machinery. So it's not an automatic point, and that's to allow for flexibility, really, and ability to adapt to circumstances as they arise.
Right. Right. I may come back to that answer and unpick that in a moment. But just before I do, you say, I think in your third statement, paragraph 17, that COBRA was not formally called in response to the Grenfell Tower fire. Is that correct?
It's correct that the ministerial meetings were not given the title of a COBRA, but in their preparation and content, they did exactly the same thing as a meeting with that brand would have done.
Right. So that I think that it takes us to the conclusion, is this right, that that doesn't mean that the Grenfell Tower was considered to be a level 1 emergency?
No, it's not the case that at the start of an event we would formally label an emergency at any one of those levels. As you rightly said, Mr. Millett, that matrix is to guide judgment rather than a set of hard and fast rules.
Yes. Can we go to your third statement, please, at page 8? You say in paragraph 16 there is no formal declaration of the level at which an emergency is classified, which allows for judgment to be applied about where an emergency lies on the scale at any particular time. The levels provide a guide to activity needed rather than activating a specific set of action or resources, which allows for a flexible and tailored approach depending on the specific circumstances of an event. This is part of the strength of the mechanism, in my view. What's the purpose of having clearly defined levels with corresponding actions as outlined in CONOPS if there's no specific reference to them?
The purpose is to help the people in that moment making the judgment. It gives a framework within which to consider where you might be on the spectrum, but then of course the specific circumstances of the event are always applied to that, which is why, as I say, it's not a trigger point, but more a guidance document.
Right. But who makes the judgment?
So the judgment is made in the conversation I described a second ago between the lead government department, CCS, and number 10. That's in the case of a civil emergency.
And is that a procedure which is provided for in CONOPS or anywhere else, or is it just how it is?
I would have to refresh my memory. I think it is referred to in the CONOPS, but it's certainly a well-tried and practiced way of operating, and it allows for a very rapid response. That's the advantage. Right,
because of the flexibility.
Because of the ability to make that judgment quickly, yes.
Can we go to page 4 of this this statement, your third statement, please? And we look at paragraph 4.5. The role of the Cabinet Office is, amongst other things, you say, to 4.5.1, decide whether and when the central government response mechanism should be activated. And then 2, ensure an LGD, lead government department, is in place.
Correct.
Without a formal declaration of the level of an emergency, how would the Cabinet Office be able to carry out its role in ensuring that a lead government department was in place?
So that the fact of a lead government department is not triggered by a particular level of crisis event, and in fact, as was the case for a fire of this nature, lead government department roles are in the vast majority of cases clear and pre-agreed, so there's no need to designate in the moment.
Right. Can we then go back, in light of that answer and the one I wanted to come back to Annex B, which was at CAB 6026, page 68. I wonder if you can just help me with this, because in it you can see that as the colours change, so does the role of LGD.
Yes.
You can see LGD is involved at yellow, centrally involved at ochre, and coordination being led by LGD in orange. And along the bottom you can see how LGD becomes involved. Which comes first, the decision as to which colour you're in other words, what the level is, or the LGD's involvement?
So the change as you move up the colours on this spectrum reflects a different level of lead government department activity. The fact of being the lead government department remains unchanged, and as I said, would be pre-agreed. So there is no declaration of being in one colour or another. This is describing the likely change in the nature of response needed from that department as the severity of an event increases.
Right, but for example, who decides that the incident is in an ochre colour? In other words, it's level 1 and LGD should lead the central response.
So it's not a decision that would be taken in that way. It would be it would be the conversation I described a moment ago between the lead government department, CCS, and number 10 to decide whether the central government activity was needed and was going to be activated. That is the decision, rather than saying we are in yellow or in amber or in ochre. The colours are intended to guide that process rather than set hard boundaries for it.
So who would decide, given a local incident at a single scene, that this was green as opposed to yellow?
So in an incident which fell within the green box on here, I would expect the local area would not be seeking support. I would expect the lead government department might well be aware of it, or DCLG colleagues might well be aware of it, but they would see no need for assistance. They would see no wider ramifications that government might need to deal with. They would see local responders having activated and dealing with that set of issues without the need for help. That's what something in the green box would look like. And the vast majority of emergency responses in this country fall into that category. They're dealt with ably by local responders with no engagement from the centre.
What would happen in a scenario where there were differences in understanding within central government about what level any given emergency was at?
So I think that would be unlikely to take place, because the decision is not to designate a level. The decision is in what mechanism to activate. And if anybody was unclear as to whether the central machinery had been activated, they would simply contact CCS to clarify that.
So I see. So CCS would be the arbiter of the rainbow. You see what I mean? No, it would decide what level.
I don't think there is an arbiter of the rainbow, because this is a guidance document. But if you were unclear what level of central response was taking place, we would certainly be the people who could tell you that.
Yes. Now, can we go to your first statement at page 12, please, paragraph 38? And you say there that when COBRA is activated, in the second line, when activated, CCS is responsible for their smooth operation and in civil emergencies acts as secretariat to COBRA, liaising with departments to understand and resolve issues, maintaining cross-government situational awareness, and briefing the chair on issues to be addressed and progress against previous actions. Do these responsibilities only arise when COBRA is activated?
They arise in relation to any ministerial meeting convened to deal with a civil emergency, whether it is branded COBRA or not. So in the case of Grenfell Tower fire, where those first 2 meetings were branded as ad hoc ministerial meetings, exactly the same set of responsibilities were engaged and the same procedures were followed.
I see. So what difference would the formal calling of a COBRA make in reality?
In practical terms, it would not.
Right. Now let's then focus on the LGD. We saw, I think, if we go to page 12, paragraph 37, the paragraph above it, I think we looked at this before, you said that the scale or complexity of an emergency means that some degree, this is the second and third lines, some degree of central government support or coordination is necessary. Where this is the case, a government department will be allocated as the lead for the overall management of the central government response. How is it determined which government department would lead in any given emergency?
So that is predetermined for the vast majority of risks, and it normally reflects the policy responsibilities of that department or their responsibility for particular capabilities that will be critical in the response. So in the case of a fire, the Home Office is responsible for fire and rescue services. It's therefore the logical lead government department.
And is it right that there will be an LGD for response and an LGD for recovery?
Yes, sometimes they are the same, sometimes they're different.
Right, and what are the responsibilities of the LGD for response?
Really to assist in drawing together situational awareness, particularly in the early stages. They provide policy advice into COBRA or into the ministerial meeting, and they are often first point of contact, essentially, for that particular event.
And for recovery?
The same, but with the focus on the recovery phase, which really means returning to normal or as close as possible to normal after the response phase of the event has ended.
And let's go to HOM 30s13085. This is entitled Department's Responsibilities for Planning, Response and Recovery from Emergencies, and it's dated March 2009. First, was this the version current as at June 2017?
I think that's correct. Forgive me, I would have to double check, but I think so.
Yeah, I mean, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, it's been some time since I looked at it, I'm afraid, but I'm aware of it.
Yes. And I think I'm right that there was no specific LGD for fire, or was there? You say it was the Home Office. Is that right?
It was certainly the Home Office, and there was no quibble about that in the case of this event.
And it's the Home Office's role, I think, to decide whether and when the central government response mechanism should be activated and ensure that there is a relevant LGD in place. Have I got that right?
Not quite. It would be the Home Office working with CCS and with number 10 to make the decision about activation of the central mechanism.
Would it always be the Home Office, or just in this case because it was a fire?
It purely because it was a fire in this case, and the Home Office was the lead government department for that risk. So
just to correct the way I put it to you, it would be is this right? It would be the CCS plus the relevant predetermined lead government department.
Correct.
Who would decide whether and when the central government response mechanism should be activated.
Plus number 10.
And number 10.
So a three-way conversation.
And at what stage would number 10, as opposed to the CCS, get involved?
It would really depend on the incident. Normally we would make contact at such point that it looked like it was likely that the central mechanism might need to be engaged, or we might make contact earlier just to keep them appraised of discussions going on. But normally very early. Right,
so would that be at yellow level, going back to the chart, the Rainbow Charter Annex B, or would it be?
I mean, we wouldn't formally declare things as at yellow level. It could be at any of those points, because of course not all incidents progress along the trajectory, but it would certainly be as soon as it seemed likely that we would need to use the central machinery.
Right. I see. Now, if we go to your third statement, please, page 15, paragraph 36, you refer there, and I could take this shortly given your last answer, but you referred there to the pre-agreement arrangements which led to the Home Office being the lead government department for the fire, for both response and recovery. But for the response, I think a DCLG for the recovery.
That's right.
And you say the roles were pre-agreed, so each department had responsibilities for their respective phases throughout. When were they pre-agreed? Was this an annual or periodic agreement, or was it ad hoc?
No, there was a pre-agreed list of responsibilities. I'm afraid I can't tell you when the Home Office first took responsibility for fire response. I would assume when those responsibilities moved into the department from DCLG.
Right. And why would DCLG be the pre-agreed department for the Grenfell Tower fire?
So the pre-agreed department for the recovery phase, of an incident of this type, because that phase is most likely to heavily engage local authority responsibilities, for which DCLG is the lead department.
And in knowing that, does the DCLG look at the NRR, the National Risk Register? What does it look at to know which incidents, which emergencies it needs to be prepared to lead on the recovery phases for?
So there's a pre-agreed list, which both they and we held.
And is that list related in any way to the National Risk Register?
Yes, it draws on the risk categories in there, yes.
I see. Can we look at the CONOPS document then, please, at page 15? This is CAB 6026, page 15. And here we have the title, Role of the Lead Government Department for Response, 2.16, where COBRA is activated. The role of the lead government department in consultation with other government departments and with support from the Cabinet Office as necessary will be to, and then there's a list which goes over the page. I'll just show you three of these. 1, produce a handling plan as soon as possible. 2, act as a focal point for communication between central government and the multi-agency, regional and/or strategic coordinating groups on the ground, involving relevant government offices in the English regions or the devolved administrations as appropriate. 3, produce a brief, accurate situation report on the nature and scale of the emergency and submit this promptly to feed into the production of the Common Recognised Information Picture, or CRIP, along with central briefing for media purposes to the Minister, copy to the Cabinet Office, who will advise on wider distribution. And then 4, ensuring that responders and affected communities have access to the resources they need to manage the emergency, and where shortfalls are required, ensure they are addressed. Now that role is prescribed in, as you can see, paragraph 2.16, where COBRA is activated. Those are the opening words. What happens where COBRA is not activated?
And if ministers are meeting in response to a crisis, whether or not it is branded as COBRA, the same procedure and responsibilities would apply.
So what do we make of the words where COBRA is activated?
I think that is, it's useful shorthand, if you like, for the activation of the central government crisis machinery, which most people would just refer to as COBRA.
Was that a common use of the term?
Yes.
I see. So when people used COBRA, they didn't mean this procedure, they didn't mean the room or rooms where Cabinet Office briefings took place. They meant activation of the central machinery for contingency responses.
I would say that is very common usage, yes.
Right. Now, in light of that answer, I just want to see if I can understand this. So you could delete the words where COBRA is activated, but then what would be the trigger which would lead to the role of the lead government department doing all the things I've read to you?
It would be the convening of a group of ministers or perhaps officials to coordinate government support in relation to a particular event.
And I think you say that that convention would be decided on after discussion between is this right, the Cabinet Office, or the CCS, number 10, and the putative lead government department?
Correct.
Because you might not know which it was.
In most cases, we would, because of that pre-agreed set of responsibilities.
Right, but putative then in the sense that until the machinery is activated, they're not actually lead government department.
No, they would still be lead government department in relation to an event of that nature, whether or not the machinery is activated.
I see. So they're lead government department by prior designation, as you've explained.
Exactly.
And in that capacity, the department participates in the discussion about whether a line is crossed so that they should do these things.
Whether further support might be needed, basically, is the question we'd be asking.
So can we take it then, moving on then, in the logic and perhaps the time, that the Home Office as LGD for the response to the Grenfell Tower fire was supposed to fulfil the requirements set out here, paragraph 2.16 of ConOps?
Yes, the responsibilities of an LGD were with the Home Office for the response phase, yes.
Yeah, even though there'd been no formal COBRA activation?
Correct.
Right. Now, from what point, can you recall, in the incident, was the Home Office required to fulfil these functions as LGD?
So the point at which the crisis machinery was activated was, I think, mid-morning on the 14th of June, where the conversation happened between Stuart Wainwright in CCS, number 10, and in consultation with the Home Office. That was the activation point.
And one more question before I ask the Chairman for the break, but did the absence of a formal COBRA activation affect or hamper or inform the Home Office's response?
In my view, no.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Well, it is, but I'd like to ask the question first. It sounds to me as though there will never be a formal activation of a procedure. There'll simply be a decision to call a meeting of ministers and or civil servants in response to an emergency.
That is in effect what COBRA is, a mechanism for bringing people together to take collective action.
Yes, so once someone, we can discuss who, if let's say, but once someone decides to call that meeting, then this machinery prescribes what will then happen.
I think that is a perfectly reasonable description, yes.
Well, I hope it's reasonable, but I hope it's accurate as well.
And accurate, yes.
Good. Right, thank you very much. Well, we'll have a break at that point. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 4. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Right, we'd like to go to the usher, please. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 4, please. Would you ask Ms Hammond to come back in, please? Right, ready to carry on, Ms Hammond?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Bell.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms Hammond, I'd like now to turn, if I can, please, to the 14th of June, the events of that day in 2017. Now, I think you tell us in your first statement at paragraph 42 that you were notified about the fire just after 3 a.m. on the morning of the 14th of June 2017. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think you were the senior civil servant on duty that night, yes?
That's right.
And were you told at that point that a major incident had been declared?
I can't recall those exact words being used. It was clear that it was going to be a serious incident, and we could see the scale of the blaze from media coverage. So I can't recall exactly whether those words were relayed to me.
Right. But did you assume that a major incident had been declared by one or other, or more perhaps, of the blue light services? Or
I think we certainly assumed it was going to be an incident of that scale.
Right. Now, what made the Band B duty officer call DCLG Red at that time, as you tell us in paragraph 43?
Because we assumed that a strategic coordinating group would be called of local responders, and the Red would provide the government liaison officer who would take part in that call on behalf of central government and provide that link.
Right. Did you ask the Band B duty officer to call Red, or did they do that of their own accord?
I think we had a conversation about it, and he made the phone call following that.
Now, at 3:49, then you emailed Stuart Wainwright, who was one of your deputy directors, who was head of the readiness and response team, yes?
Yes.
And you told him about the fire, I think. That's what you say in short in paragraph 44.
Yes, I emailed him in case anybody was calling him directly to say that the duty team were aware.
And what was it about the fire that you could see that prompted you to send that email?
As I say, I sent the email because I suspected that the scale of it may mean that somebody had called him directly rather than using the duty system. That can sometimes happen, just a human error. And I wanted him to be aware that the duty team were on the case.
Right. And then in the middle, or just before the middle of the paragraph, you say, after making some small suggestions, at 4:33 a.m., instructed him to send it to number 10, the NSA, the DNSA, and the duty private secretary in the office of the Minister for the Cabinet Office. Now, that's basically the top of UK government, isn't it? At least for contingency purposes.
Yes, so that notification was the facts as we knew them at that point, in anticipation that people would wake up, see the events on the news, and want to be assured that they were being considered.
Was it obvious to you at that point that the fire was not a green local incident, but something far higher up the colour bands in Annex B?
Well, I think the information we didn't have at that point, obviously, was how the response might unfold. So I think we assumed at that moment it was going to be significant, but wouldn't have made a specific judgment about where it sat in the colour bands, as you say.
At any rate, not green.
I don't think I was thinking in terms of green or other colours, but it was clear it was a significant incident.
Right. And what particular characteristic or feature of the fire, as you saw it, meant you thought it was going to be, or was already, a significant incident?
Well, we could certainly see the scale of the flames on the building. I think we looked at where it would be on a map and could see there'd be wider disruption to the local area, so considerations like that.
Now, the first Strategic Coordination Group meeting, or SCG meeting, took place at 5 a.m, and I think you say that DCLG Red dialed in for central government, yes?
Correct, that's normal.
Yes. Now, is it right in practice that DCLG Red was the mechanism by which CCS got SCG readouts and found out whether the SCG needed anything? Is that...
So yes, the government liaison officer is the main point. I think when I went back and reviewed the documents, There were also some readouts provided through the Mayor's office, who would also have had a presence at the SCG, but the GLO was the key link point.
Right. But the DCLG was not the designated lead government department.
Only for the recovery phase, not for the response.
Quite right, in the response. So was it the case that DCLG Red was automatically the department which would send the GLO into an incident?
Yes, correct.
Right. Then let's go to CAB 3014082. This is an email. If you go to the second email down, you can see that it's timed at 0507:56, and it's Jill McManus, and she says, just to confirm, DCLG Red duty officers are aware and are currently dialed into London SCG to receive update following declaration of a major incident. We've informed CFRA duty officer and Home Office are aware of the incident. So it looks as if it was through DCLG Red and Jill McManus who had notified the Home Office or knew that they were aware. Is that right?
I'm afraid you would have to ask the Home Office to confirm that. I think Jill is just confirming that the Home Office are aware in this email, and I can't add to that evidence, I'm afraid.
Now, if we go then to CAB 50157, this is your Exhibit 68. If you go, please, to page 2, top of page. Well, yeah, it is the top of page 2. It's an email from the CCS on the 14th of June at 7:13, forwarding the readout of the 5 a.m. SCG to Stuart Wainwright.
Yes.
You see that?
Yes.
And underneath that, you can see that Denise Welch at the DCLG had received that at 6:16, or before 6:16:06 on that morning.
Yes.
And sent an email, readout of the 05 a.m. Strategic Coordination Group, fire at Grenfell Tower. And you can see who was present at that. And there's a situation update which continues over some pages. Now, it appears to have taken CCS control almost an hour to forward the readout to Mr. Wainwright. Do you know why that was the case?
I don't know why that's the case. Mr. Wainwright would have had access to CCS control and the ability to read it, so he, in all likelihood, would have read it before that, in any case.
Right. And then if we go, please, to CAB 50157, we can see what happens a few minutes later. So Stuart Wainwright receives the email I've just shown you at 7:13, and then here we are. If you go, please, to the second email down, at 7:27 on the morning of the 14th of June, Stuart Wainwright to Alistair Whitehead. Now, Alistair Whitehead was the private secretary to the Prime Minister at the time, yes?
Correct.
And he had responsibility for Home Affairs, I think.
That's right, yes.
And he sends this email to Alistair Whitehead, does Stuart Wainwright, and he copies you in, as you can see. Alistair, read out below from an earlier SCG at 5 a.m. There is another now, which CLG and HO are dialed into. We'll get a readout from this and other sources. Fatalities are now confirmed as 4, we understand. Now, is it right that this was the first update that you'd received from DCLG Red since Jill McManus's 0507 email?
Well, I also had access to CCS control, so it's perfectly possible I had read it as soon as it was received. I'm afraid I can't recall. This is Stuart, as you say, copying me into an update to number 10.
Right. So you might have had, but you can't remember.
I'm afraid not.
Updating communications through your access to the CCS control system. Is that?
I might have read the red update sooner than this forward.
Right. Now, he goes on to say, after the, I suppose it's really a cut and paste from the SCG report, he says, after the current SCG call, we should be able to better determine any national support that is needed and any Whitehall coordination that is required. Is it right that at this stage no decision had been made about the need for national support?
Yes, I think that's right.
And then if we go please to CAB 3010263, top of page 2. We can see a further email from Mr. Wainwright at 0835 to Jill McManus and to you, copy to Peter Holland, who was the CFRA, sitting within the Home Office. Thank you to CLG and HO colleagues. Grateful for readouts from the latest SCG when available. I understand the situation is stabilising also, but do shout if things change and national resources are needed. Are you able to help with where Mr. Wainwright's understanding that the situation was stabilising might have come from?
I'm very happy to ask Mr. Wainwright, but I can't help with that without doing so, I'm afraid.
But did you know at the time, or do you know now, sitting there?
I'm afraid not sitting here, but very happy to ask him if that would help.
Well, are you able to help us as to what the national resources were, which would have been available as identified?
So at this stage, obviously, this event is in response phase, so it would have been anything that the Fire and Rescue Service in particular might need to assist them. That could be mutual aid from another force. It could be other assets that they might need. It's the normal question that we would ask, do you need anything?
You can see the reference there to Stuart Wainwright essentially asking for readouts from the latest SCG. That was the 6 a.m.
I think that's referring to the 7 a.m. SCG, if I remember correctly.
I think we're probably both wrong, actually. I think it's the 6:30 SCG. But let's go, please, to CAB 3014771. This is an email from Jill McManus at 9:15 later in the morning. But if we go, please, to page 2 of this email string, and we'll come back to that email in due course if we need to. But here is the email from Jill McManus at 8:40. She's at DCLG, as we know, emailing the CCS a readout from the 6:30 SCG. And she says, Stuart, RC, please see readout from 6:30 SCG. GLO currently in 8:30 SCG, so we will provide further information following that meeting. Now, does it look as if from this that the CCS wasn't receiving timely information about the situation on the ground?
I think it looks to me like Stuart is making every effort to ensure that it comes through rapidly. That is really helpful in the early hours of a response like this. And yes, I think there is an element of chasing here, but nothing particularly unusual.
Right. I mean, it looks from this that the DCLG Red, Jill McManus, was sending readouts from the SCG that had happened a little bit later than, or perhaps at the same time as, the next one that was in progress.
Yes. They're obviously happening in rapid succession at this time of the morning, so every 2 hours.
Had you ever experienced an incident where there were so many SCGs within such a short time frame?
Not at this point, I don't think, no.
Right. At the time, given the local authorities' role, RBKC's role as a Category 1 responder, did you have any concerns about the delay in receiving updates from DCLG?
Not specifically in relation to RBKC's role, no.
Right. Do you agree that it was imperative that information was being received by the CCS promptly from the SCGs?
Yes, that is always important.
Would you have expected SCG readouts to be sent more promptly than they were from these initial meetings, as we've seen from these emails?
Hard to make that judgment without knowing exactly what time the SCG's finished. Sometimes they can last some considerable time, but we would expect a very rapid readout.
Now, I next want to ask you about the assessment that support was not needed. And we can start this topic, or subtopic, at paragraph 46 of your first statement on page 14. So your first statement, please, page 14, paragraph 46. And you say there, in the second or third sentence, second sentence, halfway down, the message we consistently received was that the responders did not need any resources or assistance from national government. And if we go to your third statement, please, at page 9, paragraph 20, there's a question 10, which picks up on paragraph 46 of your first statement. And the question is, what was the source of the sources of the information that respondents did not need any resources or assistance from national government? And you say this at paragraph 20. This would primarily have been based on the absence of a request for assistance. We would expect local respondents to be best placed to assess the requirements on the ground and determine whether or not they have the resources to address them. Now, at what point in time are you talking about there?
So I think your question referred to my 6:10 email.
Yes, but you say in which, or to which you refer to as saying the message we consistently received was that the respondents did not need any resources or assistance from national government.
Yep.
At what point in time are you referring there?
Forgive me, I misunderstood your question. I think I'm referring to the course of the 14th, actually.
Right.
When you can see from Stuart's emails, he was asking the question, do you need national assistance? And the answer was consistently no.
And from whom were you getting that message?
Coming from the SCGs in particular, where the government liaison officer would have been, relaying that question.
Was there any proactive inquiry by CCS or by RED with RBKC to ascertain whether they might have needed resources or assistance from national government at that stage?
CCS wouldn't normally make direct contact like that. We would go through the RED network, right. And I'm afraid I can't give evidence on their behalf.
Would it be normal practice that national assistance would only be provided if expressly asked for?
That is normally the route by which it is deployed. Sometimes it's clear that people need help and it's also offered, but normally responders are very rapid in saying we need some assistance here.
And if we go please to CAB 50159 now, and look at the second email down, we now see Stuart Wainwright sending an email, and it's not clear to whom, but you certainly respond to it if you scroll up to the top of page 1. But if you look at the second email down, as I'm showing you, this is at 8:09 on the 14th of June. Stuart Wainwright writes, bringing Lorna in to see the latest. Now, Lorna was Lorna Grattan, wasn't she?
Correct.
And she was at number 10, yes?
Yes, that's right.
Right, so bringing Lorna in to see the latest. So can we date or time the first involvement of number 10 Downing Street in the Grenfell Tower fire to about this time, just after 8 a.m. on the morning of the 14th?
I think there is a previous email to Alistair Whitehead, who was also in number 10. So I think from memory that is the first...
The one we looked at before?
The first engagement with number 10.
I follow. And that, I think, we saw before at 7:27.
Yes.
Right. So what was the purpose then of bringing Lorna Grattan in?
So I think because Lorna's responsibilities in number 10 encompass DCLG's policy areas, and it would have been increasingly clear that there was a significant recovery operation that would be likely, and that would be a DCLG lead. So those recovery and response phases aren't distinct. You would start to think about both very early. So useful to have Lorna engaged and aware.
And we see Mr. Wainwright saying that the LFB was not seeking additional resources and that the NHS had capacity. You see that?
Yes.
Did you consider yourself specifically about asking whether RBKC had enough capacity or were seeking assistance?
I can't recollect asking that specific question at this moment. I would have taken the absence of a request as reassurance. Right.
I mean, it doesn't look from the documents that you yourself considered specifically going to RBKC or asking RED to go to RBKC and ask them whether they needed national assistance.
No, I would have expected that to come through the SCG if it was known to be needed.
Right. So it's a reactive arrangement, is it? The national assistance will only be provided if it's asked for by the Category 1 responder through the SCG.
Not exclusively, but as I said, in my experience, most responders are very prompt in saying where they need that assistance. So that is normally how it would work.
Right, I see. And what would happen if you could see that the local council, as a Category 1 responder, was in dire need of national assistance, but simply wasn't asking for it for whatever reason?
Then we would offer it, and I think when you come to the ministerial meetings, you can see the question being asked: what can we do to help? I don't think it can be forcibly provided, but it's not an issue that has arisen really.
Now, it's right to say that the decision was taken to convene a cross-government ministerial meeting, yes?
Yes.
And I think we can see that in a document at CAB 50337. Let's have that up. And I'm going to ask you to look at the second email on page 1 there. Before I ask you a question about it, is it right to say that a decision to convene a cross-government ministerial meeting is one usually taken jointly by the CCS number 10 and the relevant lead government department? I think that you touched on that earlier, but have I got that right?
You have.
Thank you. Now then, let's look at this email from Alistair Whitehead to a range of respondees, including you, 14th of June at 10:04. And if we turn to the very foot of that page, it says, "Re Grenfell Tower fire situation update." And then if we turn, please, to page 2, at the very top of the screen, it says, "Thanks, I've discussed with Stuart, and the Prime Minister has asked for a cross-Whitehall coordination meeting this afternoon. Given Home Secretary availability, I suggest we do this at Minister of State level, so chaired by Minister for Policing and Fire, with ministers from Health, Transport, Housing, London, etc., attending, with the Mayor of London and operational commanders." Was it the Prime Minister, therefore, that was the person who asked for the cross-Whitehall coordination meeting?
I think what is happening in that email is Alistair is formally recording the conversation that would have happened between himself and Stuart and consulting the lead government department. So that is how it would be described.
Well, as a fact, was it the case that it was the Prime Minister who had asked for the cross-Whitehall coordination meeting?
Well,
certainly suggests that, doesn't it?
I would assume that Alistair had spoken to her on the back of that conversation, and she had confirmed that she would like that to take place. That would be my assumption.
All right. Well, I mean, how does that work? Is it the case that Alistair Whitehead would have suggested to Theresa May that she should have or convene a cross-Whitehall coordination meeting, which she then confirmed, yes? Or is it the case that the Prime Minister herself, of her own volition, asked for a cross-Whitehall coordination meeting? I think you're drawing a distinction between the two.
I'm not, for practical purposes, and I'm afraid you would have to ask Alistair which was the case in this circumstance.
Right. Either way, I think we can take it that whether it was prompted by Alistair Whitehead or Theresa May herself, the decision to ask for a cross-Whitehall coordination meeting came from the very top of UK government.
Yes.
Now, then, let's go to CONOPS again, please, if we can. CAB 6026. And on page 45 there, we can see paragraph 4.2. Roman 3, top of the page. Cabinet Office will convene a meeting, if appropriate in Cobra, if there is uncertainty over the direction of the UK central government response to any emergency or the effectiveness of the local response in England and Wales, to assess the situation and advise ministers as necessary. Now, at this stage, so we are at just after 10 a.m. on the 14th, as far as you were aware, was there uncertainty about the direction of the UK central government response?
I don't think I would have described it as uncertainty over the direction. It was clearly only a small number of hours into this event, so the scale of it was still unfolding, and we were still understanding what the implications might be. That's how I would characterise it.
Right. Now, you told us there was no Cobra meeting as such. What within the ambit of Cobra, the procedure in it, was it that caused the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office to convene the meeting?
I think recognition that there could be serious implications here and a need to make sure we had understood those correctly and were able to respond rapidly to any requests for assistance.
Right, let me try this slightly more obliquely. Did ConOps play any part, or did the procedures set out in ConOps play any part in the processes adopted by central government on the 14th of June?
So I'm not sure I understand your question correctly. I mean, the ConOps sets out the processes which underpin how CCS operates. Forgive me, I may have misunderstood your question.
Well, let me be more specific. You told us earlier that there wasn't a COBRA meeting because this was a cross-government meeting decided in the light of all the circumstances and not to be regarded as a COBRA meeting. I've shown you Roman 3, which says the Cabinet Office will convene a meeting if appropriate in COBRA. So not necessarily in COBRA. If there's uncertainty about the direction, you said there wasn't. So that leads to the question, well, was the ConOps procedure relevant? Was it being used at all on the morning of the 14th of June?
Yes, I think it was, but there's obviously a degree of judgment involved here. And I think this paragraph is not setting out the only reason for which a cross-government ministerial meeting can be convened.
Right.
Well, I have to say, I get the impression that a meeting was convened because the Prime Minister wanted a meeting to be convened, and for no other reason. I'm not saying it's not a criticism, it's just a fact, isn't it?
I don't think that is the case. I mean, I think there was a conversation, that three-way conversation I described. There was recognition that this could be a serious incident that required government engagement, and in those circumstances, bringing ministers together would be a sensible thing to do.
All right, thank you.
Let me ask in a slightly different way. Can you point to which bit of COBRA I need to look at to understand what process was being adopted which led to the Prime Minister making her decision to convene a cross-government meeting?
Sorry, when you say which bit of COBRA...
Yeah, which part, which section?
Do you mean of the ConOps?
Yes.
Oh.
Sorry, you're quite right, of the ConOps procedure.
I don't have the whole document in front of me, but in essence, it is the process by which that judgment is exercised about where we might be along the spectrum of colours you described before. So a judgment is taken whether it is likely that government responsibilities could be engaged in these circumstances where it looked to be a potentially very serious incident. It was sensible to bring ministers together.
Right. Now, did you yourself consult ConOps or think about which part of ConOps you needed to look at when yourself being involved in the decision to convene the meeting?
I can't recollect doing that, forgive me.
Can we go to CAB 60337? We were there before. I just want to go back to the email, please, if we can. I don't think I've shown you the rest of it. Oh, well, I have, actually. It's back to the first paragraph. Now, is it right that this initial proposal was for the Home Secretary to chair the Cross-Whitehall coordination meeting, but that a less senior minister be appointed because the Home Secretary was unavailable? That's the impression one gets from that paragraph. Is that correct?
I think that is a reasonable inference from that paragraph.
Yes, it is, but is it factually correct?
To the best of my recollection, I'm afraid I can't remember the details of the Home Secretary's availability.
Yeah, and if we go, please, to the top email, page 1 at 10:09, this is from Stuart Wainwright to Alistair Whitehead, and it says, "Thanks, Alistair, and we just spoke. Looking like 4 p.m. for Nick Hurd chaired meeting, which will be labelled as a cross-government coordination meeting, calling notice to issue shortly." So it looks as if, is this right, Nick Hurd had been identified as the potential chair for that meeting, yes?
Yes, he's the Minister of State referred to in the previous email.
Right, and it was going to be labelled as a cross-government coordination meeting. Was that a thing, and was that a known type of meeting, recognised in the procedures?
I think yes, I think everybody would have known what that meant.
And what would they have thought it meant?
Well, I think the title it was actually given was an ad hoc ministerial meeting it does exactly the same things as a COBRA.
Right. Then moving on to that, was it COBRA? Let's go to the next email in time, which is 5 minutes later at CAB 3014775. Stuart Wainwright to a number of individuals, including Jill McManus, as we can see, and Peter Tallentire in the Cabinet Office.
Yes.
As well as CC to CCS and the Home Office Fire Duty Officer. All, heads up, likely to be a Nick Hurd policing min chaired ministerial, not COBRA, at 4 p.m. today. Details to come. We'll be looking for ministers from CLG, DH, DFT, Mayor invited also. CLG, give me a call about boroughs and local MPs. So not COBRA. Now, he makes a point, as you can see, that this is specifically not a COBRA meeting. Can you explain why that is?
I don't think I'd give you evidence on why Stuart wrote that in his email. It is factually correct that it wasn't being branded as a COBRA meeting.
Yes. What's the rationale, though? I mean, I know you weren't on this email and you're not in his mind, but what would have been the rationale, for your way of thinking at the time, for going out of your way to say that this meeting was not a COBRA meeting?
Well, he may have just been attempting to be factually correct. I think in his statement to the inquiry, Alistair Whitehead has given his description of the branding of the meeting, which to me rings very true. But as you say, I was not myself participating in this exchange.
I mean, the question really is, if it made no difference whether it was or wasn't branded a COBRA meeting, as you put it, what was the point of making the point? What was the significance of it not being a COBRA meeting?
Well, in practical terms, no significance at all. We did all of the same things. Alistair's evidence, if I can sort of paraphrase it.
Well, I think we can read it.
Yeah. Well,
Alistair's
explanation to me rings very true.
Right. Now, then, let's go back to the diagram, please, which is Annex B on page 68 of ConOps, which is at CAB 6026, please. Now, there it is. This is designed, as I think you say, to chart the likely government engagement in response to an emergency. Now, as at mid-morning on the 14th of June 2017, after the meeting, the cross-government meeting had been convened, but hadn't yet happened, where did you think the Grenfell Tower incident fell on this colour chart?
Well, I think lots of information was still emerging at that point, and that meant it was unclear whether it would land, if I can put it this way, to the left of the section you described as ochre, or in the ochre section there, because we were still gathering information about the ongoing event.
Right. Now, so you thought it was significant level 1, yes?
I think roughly that is the area which our understanding would put you in on this chart.
Right. And I know the chart is not a mathematically accurate chart.
Exactly.
I'm not asking you a mathematical question, really more one of impression, but you thought it was around about the level 1 significant, yes, with LGD leading the central response.
So I think we weren't yet clear whether it would be there or on the other side of the line. And in those circumstances, it's sensible to bring people together to be prepared for the eventuality that it does require a central response.
Right. Now, given that a decision had been made not to activate COBRA, but that nonetheless a cross-government ministerial meeting had been decided upon at the very highest level, where did that leave the COBRA not involved description? COBRA hadn't been involved, but something, to all intents and purposes, the same had. So did that tell you that this was ochre or something more serious? In other words, orange?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think as I set out, perhaps not very clearly before, this is not a set of hard and fast trigger points. So, applying judgment to it, there is an element of there was certainly a potential that it would end up being a more serious response. Information was still being gathered, So I think that the COBRA branding at that point was less important than bringing people together to understand the situation and make sure action that was needed was taken.
I mean, to your way of understanding this at the time, that the importance of COBRA was this right? Was significant here, because in the ochre band, COBRA is expressly not involved. That's why it's underlined. The not is underlined.
But that is not saying that COBRA can never be involved in a response of this type. As I said before, this is a guidance framework for the sort of likely, and that word at the top of the page is significant, response that you would expect in this kind of scenario. It does not rule out calling any kind of meeting in any of these scenarios if judgment suggests it's required.
And what was the basis of your assessment that it was, if I can use this expression, ochre-ish, perhaps tending towards the orange?
Well, I think there had been confirmed fatalities by this point on the morning of the 14th. I think it was considered to be likely that that number would rise. And we were still understanding the impacts on the surrounding area. So it was not an incident which had concluded and all of the impacts were known. They were still being understood.
Can we then go to CAB 401129? This is the agenda for the meeting at 4 p.m. that had been the subject of the Wainwright emails earlier in the day.
Yes.
And you can see the title.
Yes.
The Grenfell Tower Fire Ad Hoc Ministerial COBRA.
Yes.
To be held in LG 04 10 Victoria Street, Wednesday, 14th of June at 1600. Can you explain why the agenda circulated ahead of the 14th of June 2017 ministerial meeting describes it as an ad hoc ministerial COBRA?
I can't, I'm afraid. It may have been in the course of amending the template that remained in there, but no, I'm afraid I can't help more than that.
Now, I think you've said, and you say in your third statement, certainly, that the meetings that took place in the days after the fire were described as ad hoc ministerial meetings, and you say that made no difference in practice. And you've explained why that is, both in your statement and today.
I think we're talking about the meetings on the 14th and the 15th only.
Yes, 14th and 15th. What's the purpose of having COBRA if it makes no practical difference whether you have COBRA or you have a ministerial group?
Well, sometimes the brand of COBRA has a great deal of power. It can provide a lot of reassurance, including publicly. On occasion, if it is difficult to galvanise a response, it guarantees an immediate reaction. It certainly wasn't the case on this occasion that there was any difficulty in that regard.
What do you mean by any difficulty? So you mean you didn't need to have the brand to provide the reassurance?
I mean that government departments were doing what I would expect them to do in these circumstances.
Well, you say do what I would expect them to do in these circumstances. We know what they would do where COBRA was activated, but what are the circumstances you're talking about where it's not activated?
I mean in respect of an incident of this nature. They were doing the things that we would expect them to be doing.
Let's stick with ConOps and go back to that, please. CAB 6026, page 22. We have a flow chart. Yes, that's it. And it's the COBRA flow chart, and it shows diagrammatically the full COBRA structure. And you can see how it's set out. You've got the Strategy Group Civil Contingencies Committee at the very top, and then you've got some cells below that, intelligence and situation, and then you've got operational response, impact management group, recovery group, and public information, all fed into by scientific, technical, legal, and logistics. And underneath that, it says, the COBRA structure is designed to be flexible to adapt to the circumstances at hand. Often there will be no need for all the supporting structures to be activated. Indeed, a full activation is likely only in the most complex emergencies, particularly where there is a need to manage a mix of highly and unclassified material, or there are potentially wide-ranging consequences flowing from the initial event. For example, some terrorist scenarios. And then in 3.4, the Cabinet Office will, in consultation with the lead government department, decide on which components should be activated and how they might best be used. And there's nothing here which suggests, and I appreciate I'm only showing you a part of an 80-page procedure, there's nothing here which suggests that you could just not have COBRA but have the same thing by way of an ad hoc ministerial meeting. On the contrary, what's suggested is that here is the COBRA structure, but it can be used flexibly at the decision of the Cabinet Office in consultation with the LGD. Yes?
Based on the text in front of me, I think you're right. There's no reference to an ad hoc ministerial structure.
No. And so if the same procedures were going to be followed, as in effect COBRA, why not activate COBRA? Then everybody would know where they were, could look at the structure chart and work on the basis of a known and accepted procedure.
I think this is a question you've asked me a moment ago. I mean, practically speaking, it made no difference, is the assurance I can give you. And if you look at the elements of the structure described here, a number of elements of this were activated in support of the ad hoc ministerial meeting. So whatever the branding, I think exactly the same things were done in support of the response here. Yes,
as a response. And I'm sorry to repeat the question, but I'm not sure I really got an answer or understood the answer, in which case it's my fault. But if it's not going to make a difference, why not have it? Why not have COBRA?
I don't think I can give you a clear answer to that question, not having been in that conversation.
Now, then let's move on to another email. This is CAB 30139996. And if you go, please, to the third email down on page 1, this is from you. And it's to Camilla Marshall from the PM's press office. And she asks you, and I probably should show you the email below it, actually. Yes, let's look at page 2. I'm hesitating only because it's very small on the screen, but let's look at it. Comes in at 12:47 to Camilla Marshall, and it's copied to you, as you can see, as well as Stuart Wainwright. I'm so sorry, it's my fault entirely. Can we go to the bottom of the screen, page 2? The first question comes from Camilla Marshall. It's not clear who it's sent to. And she says, and she's at the Prime Minister's press office, and she says, if asked about the difference between a COBRA or CCS convened meeting, what would the answer be? So she's actually asked the question I've been asking you.
Yes.
And if we scroll up then to the next email, which is on page 2, Carol McCall, who is head of civil contingency communications at the NSC, sitting in, I think, in the Prime Minister's office, sitting in the Cabinet Office.
In the Cabinet Office,
yes. Well, I think probably both. She says, a very good question. On the face of it, it is location, 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 but it is a fine line between this being an update for ministers and senior officials to ensure all of the right capabilities are brought to bear in dealing with the incident, as opposed to it being a start of a series of meetings to provide high-level decision-making on an ongoing basis. And then she says, do others copied agree? So it looks as if Camilla Marshall has put her finger on the question, which seems to be a very good question. And then we can see, I think, your response, which is what I'd started with. But now let's go back to that. At the very bottom of that page, you say, at 12:58, Carol Camilla, there's an oddity here, because CCS is involved in both formal COBRAs and less formal meetings like this. So the CCS convened tag may tie us in knots a bit. I think that probably focusing on the difference between a formal crisis management response to the COBRA process, technically a cabinet subcommittee, versus a less formal coordination meeting would be more helpful. The thing which really determines the difference is whether central government has a leading role in the response. In this case, clearly it's being managed extremely well by local responders, and we are therefore checking in on resource requirements and looking ahead to what support arrangements are going to be needed from across the system in the next few days. And Camilla Marshall comes back and says, that's helpful, yes, and this is just for our internal awareness. I'll flag if a formal question comes to us. Now, is it right that at the time, the difference in your mind, as this seems to demonstrate, between the formal COBRA process and the less formal coordination meetings with ministers is whether central government has a leading role in the response?
Yes, I mean, I think what that email reflects more eloquently than I am doing here is the uncertainty on which side of the yellow ochre line, as you described it, this response would end up being on. So at that moment in time, in the response phase, clearly the fire service were on the ground and leading on extinguishing the blaze. The police service were on the ground, leading on managing the area around the tower. And therefore what the requirement might be on central government in that moment was still emerging. And as I think I said before, we were beginning to understand that that was more likely to be needed in the recovery phase, which of course began 2 days later with the recovery task force on Friday of that week.
Well, you were at pains, I think, earlier to point out that there was no real difference between COBRA and the meeting that was convened, the 4 o'clock meeting that was convened, named not COBRA by Stuart Wainwright specifically. But in fact, looking at this, it appears that there was a difference in your mind. Is this right? That COBRA, if activated, would have been a formal crisis management response, which is something you didn't want at that time. What you wanted instead was a less formal coordination meeting by way of information gathering.
I think I'm really clear that the practical operation of those two things was exactly the same. We did all of the things that we would have done for something branded a COBRA meeting. This exchange is thinking about how to explain that difference, in a press context, I think. But the basic point is the same. The central government role was at that point emerging and not yet clear.
Is it right to say that COBRA wasn't activated on the 14th of June because it was understood, at least by you on the face of this email, that the response was, quotes, being managed extremely well by local responders?
I think at that moment there was no indication that the responders on the ground were in need of additional assistance, and we were doing as far as it's possible to assess exactly what we would expect them to be doing at that moment.
And was it as a consequence that central government at that stage was thought, at least by you, not to need to play a leading role?
I think at that moment there wasn't a clear decision for central government to take. There wasn't a clear ask for resources or for help. So we were certainly expecting that might come in the days ahead as it headed into recovery phase. But there was no immediate and urgent thing that we needed to do.
And had it been clear to you or the CCS at the time that RBKC was struggling in the response, would COBRA have been called formally?
It's certainly a possibility. It's very difficult to make the judgment without, all the circumstances of that moment.
And the distinction you're drawing here in this email is between the formal crisis management response versus a less formal coordination meeting. What in practice would have been different if COBRA had been activated at that time?
Nothing different in practical terms. As I've said, the meeting would have been convened in the same way, with the same agenda and the same attendees.
Mr. Chairman, we're going to turn to a different topic which will take me more than 5 minutes to finish.
Well, would you rather break at that point? Might be sensible, I think, mightn't it?
It might be sensible, yes.
Yes. Well, it's slightly ahead of time, Ms. Hammond, but it's rather than embark on a new topic at this stage and break it off after a couple of minutes, I think it would be wiser to stop at this point. So we'll do that. We're going to have to ask you to come back for some more questions
Of course.
tomorrow, I'm afraid, but I think you were expecting that.
I was.
And so we'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And just to remind you, if I may, please don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone overnight.
Understood.
Thank you very much. We'll see you
you.
tomorrow then. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. Well, we break there. We resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please. Thank you.